William Foster, as a trombonist, do you have to play many notes in this adagio?
You know, it's actually quite a scary one because there's very few, but they really have to be gems when they come in. They really have to be pearls, and it's an easy movement to ruin as a trombonist. If the strings are making a beautiful sound and you come cluttering in at the end when it should be delicate, it's not many notes, but scary notes, I would say, in this movement.
It's all about timing and balance.
Definitely, and not falling asleep in the rehearsals. So here, that's the big one.
Welkom bij een nieuwe aflevering van Bucketlist. Ondertussen weet u het al, een podcast van Brussels Philharmonic over symfonische werken die u toch zeker op uw bucketlist moet hebben staan. En vandaag praat ik met een trombonist, William Foster. En deze podcast zal ook in het Engels zijn. William, welcome.
Thank you very much.
William, when I talk to trombonists, I always bear in mind two things. One, trombone players, they like telling jokes.
Oh, that's a lot of pressure. What a way to start. Okay, I'll try and think of something by the end of the episode.
And when they play, it's all about waiting and timing, correct?
Certainly about waiting. The timing we do our best, but certainly about waiting.
Trombonisten moeten soms ook wachten als ze moeten spelen in een symfonisch orkest. Which classical music piece should be on your bucket list?
So, for sure, Elgar 1. Just for so many reasons, as a symphony, it's worth exploring. I think it has an important place in the classical music canon. Mm-hmm. And I think it's maybe often neglected outside of the UK. And so I think as a piece to really use as a way into English classical music and for an alternative take on the symphonic history of classical music, I think Elgar 1 is a really important one. It's a big piece.
William, we only need to hear a few notes, only just a few seconds to realize this is a piece composed by Edward Elgar. Why do you think can we recognize an Elgar composition in just a few seconds?
I think that's actually a very, very interesting question because I think a lot about Elgar is a synthesis of a lot of other composers of the time and a lot of hybrid of styles. I think he has a very particular way of beginning pieces of music.
Okay.
I think he has a certain mode of expression, this sort of noble pomposity. I mean, Elgar 1 encapsulates it more than any other piece. But there's a certain manner of communicating emotion which is very Elgarian.
Okay.
Something quite stately, something about not overwriting, overscoring. This piece was written in 1908 when a lot of his contemporaries were really looking at something complicated. But this, it's a simple melody, it's a simple bass line.
Can you say rather conservative?
Perhaps, actually. I think he begins his piece relatively conservatively. Later, there's a lot of artifice, there's a lot of complexity in his music, but I think that happens in a later developmental process in the musical compositions. He tends to start with a very simple statement of a theme and then develop it later on. There's no bombastic Straussian beginning to a piece of music, something simple which evolves as time goes on. And for me, that combination of a simple theme, that mode of musicality, that sort of pomposity, that elegance. To me, that's what makes something quite Elgarian.
Oké, dus verschillende elementen samen, ook heel mooi gebalanceerd een werk beginnen, heel nobel, heel sentimenteel, maar ook de balans in de instrumenten niet overdrijven in alles wat Elgar neerschrijft. Dat is een beetje typisch om hoe Edward Elgar zijn symfonie begint, in dit geval de eerste symfonie. Did you say that this first symphony is a bit neglected in Europe, but is pretty famous or popular in England?
I think that's a fair assessment, actually. Yes, it's incredibly well performed in the UK.
Yeah.
Elgar's music in general, for obvious reasons, we're very proud of this composer, and it has obviously a lot of history in England. So the Halle premiered this piece, the London Symphony played it very early on, so it's really born into those orchestras' sound and identity. And I think perhaps certainly in the early 20th century, English music was slightly neglected, especially in Germany and in French-speaking countries. And now it's becoming increasingly popular, but I still don't think it has the same place in the canon as it does in the UK. And certainly if you go over to America, Elgar's music is really very underperformed, regrettably so.
Why is the UK proud of Edward Elgar?
I think the blunt and unfortunate answer is we don't have so many great composers. You know, if you really want to look at the history of classical music, up until the 21st century, in the late 20th century, we don't really have. We had Purcell, and then we had a huge gap. And then I think for a long time we had a very bad reputation. You know, there's the famous article in Germany from 1904 that called it Das Land ohne Musik, the land without music, which is harsh.
Yeah.
But I think when we had a composer who was very special, we become very proud of this, as any country does. You know, you have your few staple composers who define a country's musical sense. And I think Elgar's music defined a lot of the music that was to follow. People like Parry, people like Vaughan Williams, people like Walton, Malcolm Arnold even later, all base their sounds largely on Elgar's music. So we are very proud of him.
Ja, dus weinig componisten eigenlijk in een bepaalde periode. Zeker Henry Purcell, waar de UK trots op was, bij wijze van spreken. En toen kon Edward Elgar die schoenen vullen, die trots om eigenlijk een nieuwe componist te worden, waar heel veel andere latere componisten, onder wie Ray Vaughan Williams, zich op baseerden. Dus Elgar was toch wel een hoeksteen in het land dat soms het land zonder muziek werd genoemd in een artikel begin de jaren 1900. Maar Elgar heeft daar verandering in gebracht, gelukkig. William, first things first. Edward Elgar, born in 1857. He died in 1934. Maybe we can summarize his life in a few sentences.
Sure. So he was quite a late bloomer, and I think his life took very much an upward trajectory quite late on. So he wasn't born into a particularly privileged household, and which is odd because now we think of him very much as the aristocratic composer and this famous image of this nice man in a three-piece suit with a mustache. But that's not actually where he began. And in class-conscious England at this time, he was very, very aware of this and very frustrated by it. So his earliest compositions were not particularly well received. And then relatively late in his life, in his 30s, 40s, he married into upper-class society. And he had a huge amount of success with pieces like Pomp and Circumstance, the Enigma Variations, his most iconic works. And then he really exploded. In the last 30 years of his life, maybe 40, he was a very, high upper echelons of British society, the English composer of the time.
He was also self-taught. I mean, he learned all the things by himself.
Absolutely, and he was famously incredibly keen to pursue more and more, different things. What's interesting about his music for a self-taught composer is the level of detail and artifice and construction behind his music is phenomenal. This is not raw, unrefined music of someone with a lot of passion, a lot of ideas, but very little skill. He really understood the craft. He was a trombonist, which I find very exciting. And he made a point of learning instruments of the orchestra so he could write better for them. So a very interesting approach into music society, yeah.
So when you play this first symphony by Elgar, you also have the feeling as a trombonist that Elgar knows how to play the instruments?
Absolutely, 110%. You know, he relies on a lot of tropes of, particularly for the trombone, of the way that other composers were writing for the trombone. He employs the chorales, but he goes higher, he goes lower, he goes faster, he goes quieter, he goes louder, because he knew what the instrument could do. And it makes it very excitable, very interesting to play.
What makes it interesting in this first movement to play for the trombone?
So I think what's very exciting about this first movement is this change from something very calm and elegiac and pompous, like we discussed before, into something really quite fiery and dramatic. And that turnaround that you have to do, not only as a trombonist, but everyone in the orchestra, you have to suddenly shift gears from this beautiful, serene opening, and for the trombones, these quiet little delicate chorales, in something really quite fiery and aggressive and brutal. Incredibly high for the trombone parts in places in the middle of the movement, incredibly fast. And then suddenly to go from that into something soft and understated at the end is enjoyable and challenging, really.
Swifty emotional state of mind.
Yes, I think so. And also just technically, literally shifting gears of going from one mindset of now we're playing in this mode to now we're playing in this mode. And that's quite a challenge and quite an interesting thing to have to try and do.
Do you have stress when you have to start playing a symphony by Elgar?
I would say somewhere between excitement and nerves. Maybe more on the excitement side, but I don't know. It depends how well rehearsed it is.
Het eerste deel uit de eerste symfonie van Edward Elgar. Er staat ook bij de titel Nobilmente e semplice. That's how you have to play it, simple and noble.
Mm-hmm.
And also the beginning of this first movement reminds me of another famous piece by Elgar. Maybe you can guess which piece I'm thinking about.
Oh, there's a lot which starts fairly similarly. I'm guessing you're moving towards Enigma Variations.
Oh yes, William.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. No, because the Enigma Variations were composed before this first symphony.
Absolutely, yep.
Maybe Elgar also felt that the Enigma Variations had a nice way of evolving a melody, which he could use again in this first symphony.
I think I would almost quite strongly disagree. Because what's very curious about the first symphony is the way that you have this theme that we're listening to right now, and it comes back relatively unchanged throughout the symphony. This is the theme that is the finale, is based around this, but much more grandiose and with much more brass and percussion. And you have moments throughout the first movement where you have all this chaos and this storm and this fire like we discussed, and then this theme just reappears, undeveloped, unchanged.
Yeah.
And in the Enigma Variations, yes, there is a gradual evolution of the material as it gets more and more complicated and then, again, suddenly simple in something like Nimrod. But in this symphony, his approach to the thematic material isn't the main mode of transformation and development. That's done through orchestration and the harmonic twists and the gestural shifts that we go through. The actual theme is interestingly a sort of a pivotal point that keeps reappearing, so you know where you are in the symphony. It's a monument that pops up time and time again. So I think the Enigma Variations, you can definitely hear a huge amount of that in this symphony. And I think he learned a lot from the process of composing this, certainly in the sense of orchestrating a large-scale 40-minute work. That's very obvious. But I think the first symphony has very different modus operandi. The actual fundamental building blocks of how he went about writing these 4 movements as opposed to the 15, I think, of Enigma Variations. It's very different.
Ja, dus de Enigma Variaties die stonden al op papier toen Edward Elgar aan deze eerste symfonie begon. Dus hij kon zich daarop baseren. Maar William zegt toch dat de manier waarop de melodie en het thema ontwikkelt is toch helemaal anders bij de Enigma Variaties. Ontwikkelt die melodie echt? Terwijl bij deze eerste symfonie komt er een bepaald thema bijna onveranderd terug. Het is een soort van kapstok dat dan plots terugkomt, zodat je het gevoel hebt van oké, hier zitten we in de symfonie. En bij de Enigma Variaties is dat toch een heel andere functie, die melodie. En ook echt hier ook opgebouwd, 4 grote delen, die symfonie. Terwijl de Enigma Variations uit meer dan 10 delen bestaat. Dus het is toch een heel andere modus operandi. Toch een groot verschil met de Enigma Variaties. Maar het blijft natuurlijk ook wel Edward Elgar op een manier. What is Elgar trying to tell us with his music?
That is a very difficult question to answer. And I think there's a lot of conflicting opinions about what Elgar set out to do. Now he is heralded as the emblem of British music making. And we're very proud of that, like we discussed. But I'm not entirely convinced that that's what he set out to do. His music wasn't written to be English. Indeed, compared to other composers of the time, he wasn't interested in using folk melodies. He wasn't trying to say, this is English. I believe he was just trying to say, this is me, this is Elgar. And especially with this first symphony, its construction is very much built on musical material and musical development as opposed to extra musical ideas. It's not trying to tell us a story, it's not trying to paint a picture. At this time in his life, Elgar was interested in the music of Brahms and this idea of absolute composition. So nothing operatic, nothing tone poem-esque, just very pure musical development for the sake of it.
Craftsmanship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was really important to him this time, and we know this. So also in the Enigma Variations, he's painting pictures of his friends, but it's mostly about what he's doing with the music itself. And so I don't, personally, when I hear this music, I don't think he's trying to tell us something particular about himself, about Englishness or something silly like this is often perceived to be. I think he's genuinely just trying to create a well-rounded, well-completed symphony. Because, to write your first symphony when you're in your 40s is already, that's quite an interesting thing. The symphony was the main vehicle for musical expression for so many composers for so long. And Elgar waited a long time before he entered into the symphonic genre. And he went into it with a very clear atmosphere of, I can write a symphony. I can do this thing of writing a 40-minute piece of music based on these 4 movements, fast, fast, slow, fast. And this is how I want to do it. It's absolute craftsmanship as opposed to lyrical tone painting.
Also, Johannes Brahms waited for a long time to start composing and finishing his first symphony. According to you, we also have to listen to the third symphony by Johannes Brahms if we talk about this first symphony by Elgar.
I think so, yeah. And the Brahms parallel is very interesting. And I think we can draw a lot of connections between the two. Number one, there is a direct link of Elgar was heavily inspired by Brahms's music. But Brahms was famously reluctant to write a symphony in the wake of what happened with Beethoven. There's this quote of, it's so difficult to compose with this giant marching behind me. And this idea that the symphony had been completed, and how does he reinvent the German symphony? And I think there was a lot of pressure, and that's why he waited quite long. In Elgar, it's slightly different, but it's the same problem of there's a lot of pressure to write the English symphony. People had tried and people had failed. Every other country had a symphonist of some form. Sweden had Stemhard, Germany had a million, Austrian had Symphony, Tchaikovsky in Russia, and England didn't have anyone. So I think like Brahms, Elgar felt a lot of pressure to write something. And like Brahms, his solution was not to go overtly nationalistic or complicated, but just to write a pure, well-constructed piece of music. And yes, for me, the third symphony of Brahms, it has a similar sense of artifice, of creation, of really working through the material, of really diligence to the harmonic developments and the structure. And this first movement of Brahms' third symphony, the shape, this complicated sonata form, to me matches very clearly onto the first movement of Elgar's and the way the material changes. And the orchestration, I think, in places the expression is very similar as well.
Het begin, het eerste deel, is dit uit de derde symfonie van Johannes Brahms. Maar volgens William, trombonist bij Brussels Philharmonic, zijn er toch veel gelijkenissen met die eerste symfonie van Edward Elgar. Want ook Elgar die voelde dus eigenlijk een druk, in zijn geval van het Engels publiek, een druk om een nieuwe symfonie te schrijven die een beetje het Engeland zou vertegenwoordigen, net zoals Brahms dat moest doen. Hij moest de nieuwe Beethoven worden. Hij voelde ook die druk en daarom duurde het lang bij Brahms en dus eigenlijk ook wel bij Edward Elgar om uiteindelijk die eerste symfonie klaar te krijgen. He was a kind of a late bloomer because shortly after his 50th birthday in 1907 he settled down to work on his first symphony. So it took a while. And actually, if you look at other famous works by Elgar, such as his celloconcerto, 1919, it all took a while to find a way of expressing what Elgar wanted to say.
I think that's true. And what's also very interesting, if you look at his history of the pieces of music written in a traditional format, so such as the cello concerto, also the violin concerto, and his 2 symphonies came very late. Beforehand, he'd written a lot of music, but they were in less conventional forms. So there were a few playful tone poems, Cockaigne, in the south, these kind of things, and then a few cantatas and lyrical works.
What's the Cockaigne overture?
Cockaigne Overture was a piece he wrote about 10 years. It was when he was already quite popular. He wrote it at a similar time to the Enigma Variations.
Okay.
And it's one of the only pieces he writes which is based on an English idea, so on English subject matter. Everything else he took inspiration from elsewhere. And so, yeah, it's a very fascinating piece, but there was no pressure on how to write a tone poem or how to write about a story of English music or whatever. But there is pressure on how to write a cello concerto or a violin concerto and a symphony.
Yeah.
So I think he took his time honing his craft, developing his skill, and then when he was convinced he could do it, sat down to write basically forms which would be competing with, the classics. If you're going to write a violin concerto, it's going to have to be played and compared to Brahms, Beethoven, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. So, I think he really wanted to wait until he was ready, would be my interpretation.
It took some time.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And now, interestingly, people are starting to rediscover his earlier works. And now they're becoming more interesting, and you can trace how he developed his style and how he learned. As we said before, he was self-taught. Mm-hmm. How he learned on the fly and how his style slowly evolved.
Ja, dus deze overture Cockaigne is eigenlijk een vroegwerk van Edward Elgar, waarin hij gewoon een beetje zijn eigen ding deed, zonder zich aan het grote genre te wagen. Geen vioolconcerto dat dan met andere grote vioolconcerto's vergeleken kon worden. Nee, deze overture Cockaigne was gewoon een pleziertje en zonder druk. En zegt William, nu is het wel interessant, omdat we weten, Elgar heeft symfonieën geschreven, heeft concerto's geschreven. En nu wordt het interessant om eigenlijk naar die jonge werken van Elgar te kijken en om te zien hoe hij geëvolueerd is tot de componist zoals we hem vandaag kennen. Let's go back to the first symphony by Elgar, the second movement. So what's happening right there?
So we've gone out of this noble, semplice first movement, and now we're into this more, he doesn't call it a scherzo, but it's essentially a scherzo. It's not in three, but it's, I think the label is vivace or something like this. It's a lively, more energetic, more dramatic piece with these beautiful little interludes and the solo violin and flutes, which sort of pop up time and time again. So it's a big change of pace from the opening theme of the first movement, and something quite playful, I would say, with moments, hints of fire, but it's generally a playful scherzando style piece.
Het tweede deel, Allegro molto, uit deze eerste symfonie van Elgar. This is a scherzo, this movement, which is also kind of a conventional movement for a very classical symphony, which makes it interesting because he was a huge fan of Brahms' Third Symphony, but also of Mozart's Symphony No. 40. Is there a kind of Mozart influence in this First Symphony?
I can see there is. Not in sound world, obviously, and the world of music writing had changed a lot, but especially if we go quickly back to the first movement. The first movement is a very, very clearly composed, very complicated sonata form. And Mozart was obviously one of the main proponents of how you can use the sonata form as a vehicle for quite complicated expression, how you can play with the models. And Elgar's really doing this in this first movement. He's really playing with the conventional sonata form. It's very cleverly done. The development's very important. There's the fascinating feature of the first theme is in A-flat major and the second's in D minor. So as far away as you could possibly get. Yeah. And sort of setting himself this compositional challenge. And yes, I think...
Again, craftsmanship.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even if you can't trace the sound world directly to Mozart, this mindset of how can we play with conventional models and turn them into something more interesting. And Mozart's late symphonies are certainly a classic example of this. Of, how is he taking a form which has been overused extensively and reworking it and playing with it and changing certain things. And I think Elgar's very much coming out of this compositional path.
Does this first symphony go to a certain climax in the whole structure of the work, or do we have 4 climaxes every movement?
No, well, the other thing that's very interesting about, and especially with this scherzo, it's not a naval scherzo, but essentially is that it runs straight into the third movement. the adagio. So already there's a bit of play because typically you should have the slow movement before the scherzo, and he mixes those. Yeah. But the way it blurs together, there is a sense of through composition in this whole symphony. And also in the way that the first theme you have, speaking of climaxes, comes back in the finale as the ultimate final climax, fully orchestrated, rich brass and percussion. So there is a teleology from start to finish. There is a slow growth and a development. It's certainly not 4 distinct units.
It was composed or premiered by the conductor Hans Richter and Halley Orchestra. And apparently during the rehearsals, the conductor Hans Richter spoke with a sound of tears in his voice and said, this is a real adagio, such an adagio as Beethoven would have written. Dirigent Hans Richter, die het toen in première dirigeerde en tijdens de repetities, stond hij met tranen in zijn ogen en met een bibberende stem, omdat hij zei, eindelijk nog eens een adagio zoals Ludwig van Beethoven dat zou schrijven. No words needed, I think, to describe the beauty of it.
It's really very, very special. And certainly this movement, to me, you can link directly to the Enigma Variations, to Nimrod, the most iconic, probably the most iconic piece of English classical music we have. This movement comes out of the same vein. I think it's something Elgar does especially well. Yeah, with this slow, drawn-out, beautiful melody, richly orchestrated. It is stunning.
There must be a formula, no?
Well, if there is, I don't think anyone else has really worked it out since then. It's something quite special.
Yeah. William Foster, as a trombonist, do you have to play many notes in this adagio?
It's actually quite a scary one because there's very few, but they really have to be gems when they come in. They really have to be pearls, and it's an easy movement to ruin as a trombonist. If the strings are making a beautiful sound and you come cluttering in at the end when it should be delicate, it's not many notes, but scary notes, I would say, in this movement.
It's all about timing and balance.
Definitely, and not falling asleep in the rehearsals. So here, that's a big one.
Edward Elgar once instructed the orchestra to play it like something you hear down by the river, the sound of an orchestra.
I think that's a funny one because Elgar's orchestrational style is certainly unique. I think it's quite distinctive, but you can really trace the influences where it's coming from.
Yeah,
there's a lot of sort of late 19th century French orchestrational techniques. There's a lot of subtlety, a lot of delicacy in the way he handles the orchestra, which is quite French. There's also this slightly Brahmsian colours, which are familiar, tropes from Brahms's music, the cello and horn lines, an Elgar classic, and that's directly borrowed. There's Wagnerian influences, which are hard to miss, and so his treatment of the orchestra you can really pin down to very, very particular set of influences, and you can see how he learnt this.
Yeah.
And for me, that's one of the fascinating things about the way his music is received, is there's this idea of the Elgarian colour, the English colour, in his orchestration, but there's nothing truly English about that aspect of his music. It's all borrowed. It's all, it's an amalgam of different stylistic influences that you can really pick apart quite easily. I mean, I think now we're getting onto this idea of what is English in Elgar's music is a fascinating one. And perhaps I take quite a hard line on it, but I don't think there's anything intrinsically English in the music that you can link to an English psyche or a sense of English culture. He doesn't use folk songs. He borrows his influences. I think this idea of Elgar as the English composer that's so often invoked in casual conversation is a learned association. I don't think it's intrinsic to his music. I think when he wrote these pieces, it was very much sort of, we finally have an English composer. Everyone's going to talk about this. And such was the climate of the early 20th century, this sort of nationalistic centrification of ideas.
Yeah.
Even his contemporaries used to talk about it as, he's the aristocratic composer, he's the English composer. And I think that's just a product of the politics of the time, rather than linking to anything in his music. And nowadays, we still talk about Englishness in Elgar's music, but I think it's not traced to the material itself. It's because for 100 years, we've associated pomp and circumstance, Nimrod, the first symphony, with very English events, the monarchy, ceremonies.
Last night of the proms.
Exactly. So we associate it with Englishness, but I'm not sure the music itself is.
Interesting.
That's maybe a slightly controversial thing to say, but maybe this is too far. If you go into sort of musical semiotics and aesthetics, music can either symbolize things, what's it, Peircean semiotics. Everything is either a symbol or it's an icon. I.e., it means something because we learn that it means that thing. Or it symbolizes it iconically, as in we associate it with that because it has some resemblance to it. So if I write the word dog on a piece of paper, it's a symbol. There's nothing about those three squiggles which make you think of a dog. It's just the fact that we've learned that.
Yeah.
Whereas if I draw a dog, that's an icon. You recognize it as a dog.
Yeah.
And I think Elgar's music symbolizes Englishness symbolically. We've learnt that it does. Elgar was English. It's played at the last night of the proms. Therefore, it's English. I don't think it's an icon. It's not like a picture of a dog. You can't take a particular phrase, pull it apart and say, oh, look, there's Englishness in here. I don't think it really works like that.
Compared to The Lark Ascending by Ralph Vaughan Williams?
Even then, I would say that's an association. I think a counterexample would be some of the variations on English folk songs.
Yeah.
You could say, look, there we can pin down, look, this is English because of the material is itself English and has a history. Even The Lark Ascending.
Or Greensleeves, or,
Exactly, something like this. I think Elgar's, especially the first symphony, which as we discussed is such absolute music, I think whenever we talk about the Englishness of it, I think we're talking about something that doesn't truly exist or something that exists outside of the music. There's a lot of casual conversation about this idea that it somehow expresses the English aristocratic sentimentality or this idea of not wearing your heart on your sleeve but restrained emotion. I don't think that's true. I think when you really dig into it, I think that's a construct that makes his music more familiar and makes it more typical for us. But yeah, as I say, I don't think it's really truly English in the notes. I think it's English in how we recognize the music and its place in our society.
Interessant wat trombonist William Foster zegt. Hij zegt eigenlijk die muziek van Elgar is niet per se in de strikte zin van het woord Engels, omdat er niet echt Engelse volksmelodieën worden gebruikt als vertrekpunt. Het wordt meer geassocieerd met Engelse gebeurtenissen. Bijvoorbeeld Pomp and Circumstance March op The Last Night of the Proms of bepaalde evenementen waar we die muziek van Elgar laten horen. En daarom wordt het als Engels bestempeld. Maar als je puur naar de muziek zelf kijkt, is het niet per se Engels in de strikte zin van het woord. Het maakt het niet per se Engels. Het wordt ermee geassocieerd wat wij Engels zien of waarmee we het associëren. Ook het aristocratische, gevoelige van Elgar, dat is eigenlijk iets wat we zo gewoon zijn geworden, maar dat is niet echt waar het uit vertrekt, die muziek van Elgar. Boeiende babbel met William Foster. William, let's talk about the last movement of this first symphony.
Yep.
How should we listen to this movement?
So this is really the apotheosis. We said it's a teleological symphony. We're going from the opening theme all the way to this end point, and this is our arrival moment. It's grandiose, it's extravagant, it's exuberant, it's beautiful, and it's really Elgar showing off, the full range of expression, this massive orchestral sound. It's phenomenal.
Zo begint het laatste deel, het vierde deel uit die eerste symfonie van Edward Elgar. Finally in 1908, December 3rd, the first performance was given by the Halley Orchestra, conducted by Elgar's dear friend Hans Richter in Manchester, England. Also after the third movement, the slow movement, Elgar was forced to go on stage and to greet the audience. There was a standing ovation. What's your favorite part in this symphony for the trombone?
I think we're listening to it right now. It's glorious to play, and I think what's wonderful about his orchestration here is he doesn't just have the entire orchestra playing the tune in unison. He has the brass really belting it out, with then all this florid decoration you can hear around in the strings and in the harp. And to play it is wonderful because you really feel like you're in the middle of this bustling whirlwind of music and emotion, and it's fantastic. And also, we get to play very loudly, which is...
Ze mogen luid spelen in de finale. Een wervelwind, zeker ook voor de kopers voor de trombone. This symphony had also a very universal message because in 1909, this first symphony received 82 performances all over the world, including America, Australia, and Russia. Why, you think?
I think the simple, maybe idealistic answer is because people recognize very quickly the power of this music, and ignoring everything else, ignoring any politics or, sense of nationalism. It was fantastic music, and people recognize that, and I think people can appreciate that. It was also, Elgar wrote this after he was fairly well connected, certainly in the UK. So he had conductors such as Hans Richter, who were pioneering and championing his music. So he had a lot of connections. The skeptic in me says that maybe there's an argument that it was a point of fascination to have an English composer writing a symphony. It was only very recent, as we said before, this idea of das Land ohne Musik was still fresh in the minds, and you can understand there's an argument people wanted to hear, what happens if an English composer has done a really good symphony? How are we going to respond to this? But really, I think it's fantastic music. People recognize the quality of the craftsmanship, and I think the emotions that Elgar's playing with are quite distinctive, quite unique, and quite fascinating. And so I can fully see how in 1909 and 1910, the music, it sort of snowballed. And the more it got played, the more people wanted to play it. And it really found its way across the globe.
The First Symphony by Edward Elgar met trombonist van Brussels Philharmonic, trombonist William Foster. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elgar.